You can quit a job, you can move to another city, you can even change countries. But you cannot exit the financial system, not because you lack discipline or intelligence, but because the system you live in was never designed to allow escape. What most people call capitalism did not emerge as a neutral marketplace of free choice. It evolved step by step into an economic structure where participation is mandatory, risk is unavoidable, and opting out quietly carries a cost. To understand why the modern financial system feels inescapable, we have to understand how capitalism was actually formed. Not in theory, but in practice. Early capitalism was not financialized, and it was commercial. In pre-industrial societies, most people lived largely outside formal markets. Food was produced locally. Shelter was not mortgaged. Survival did not require credit. Money existed, but it was not dominant. Debt existed, but it was limited. Markets existed, but they were not totalizing. Economic participation was optional, localized, and often seasonal. This mattered because exit existed. People could step outside markets without being structurally punished. That possibility would not last. One of the earliest moments when capitalism became unavoidable occurred quietly in rural England. For centuries, land had been held in common. Villagers farmed shared fields, grazed animals, and survived largely outside formal markets. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, this changed with the enclosure movement. Landowners, backed by parliament, fenced off common land and converted it into private property. Peasants lost access to food, shelter, and self-sufficiency. No law forced people into wage labor. But without land, there was no alternative. People migrated to cities. They sold their labor. They entered markets, not by choice, but by necessity. This was capitalism's first lock-in. Participation became the price of survival. The Industrial Revolution intensified this shift. Factories required upfront capital, centralized labor, machines, fixed infrastructure. Independent craftsmen could not compete with industrial scale. Ownership separated from labor. Skill became less valuable than access to capital. Time discipline replaced autonomy. Workers owned neither tools nor output, only their labor, which had to be sold continuously. Capitalism no longer needed force. Dependency was enough. Escape still existed in theory, but in practice, exit meant poverty, not freedom. By the 19th century, capitalism had changed form. It was no longer centered on trade between individuals. It became a system organized around capital accumulation. Capital funded production. Production created wages. Wages fueled consumption. Consumption justified further capital expansion. This closed loop made participation self-reinforcing. Once inside, leaving meant losing income, security, and status. Capitalism began enforcing participation indirectly, through structure rather than coercion. The rise of modern banking completed the transformation. Banks did not merely store money. They created it through lending. This changed the system fundamentally. When money is created as debt, growth requires borrowing. Stability requires repayment. Expansion requires participation. Households borrowed. Businesses leveraged. Governments issued debt. Opting out became economically disadvantageous. Saving without investing was punished by inflation. Avoiding credit meant losing access to housing, education, and opportunity. Capitalism stopped being a market system. It became a financial obligation system. Early financial capitalism was unstable. Banks failed. Credit collapsed. Crises were frequent. The solution was central banking. In the US, the Federal Reserve was created in 1913 after repeated banking panics. Its purpose was not fairness, it was stability. Central banks provided lender of last resort support, crisis backstops, controlled credit expansion. This made capitalism safer, but also more entrenched. Once the system could be rescued, it could grow larger. Debt expanded, leverage increased, participation deepened. Capitalism became not just dominant, but protected. After the Great Depression and World War II, governments promised stability. Jobs and housing, retirement, healthcare. But instead of removing financial dependence, these guarantees were built on top of markets. Public pensions invested in stocks. Housing relied on mortgages. Healthcare relied on insurance. Governments funded promises through debt. The welfare state did not free citizens from capitalism. It embedded them deeper inside it. Your future security became inseparable from market performance. In 1971, the United States ended the gold standard. Money was no longer redeemable for anything outside the system. This was a turning point. From that moment, currencies floated. Inflation became permanent. Holding cash became risky. Assets became necessary to preserve value. There was no longer a neutral store of wealth outside financial markets. Capitalism absorbed money itself. Even savers lost an exit. By the late 20th century, finance entered everyday life. Wages routed through banks. Savings pushed into funds. Retirement tied to equity markets. Insurance required for survival risks. Capitalism stopped being something you participated in. It became something you lived inside. Participation was no longer a decision. It was infrastructure. Defined benefit pensions declined. Defined contribution plans rose. 401ks, IRAs, and private retirement accounts replaced guarantees. Workers became investors, willingly or not. Your retirement no longer depended on years worked. It depended on market performance. Capitalism no longer waited for participation. It enrolled you automatically. The modern financial system cannot tolerate mass exit. If households stop borrowing, housing markets collapse, banks lose collateral, growth contracts. If investors stop allocating capital, pensions fail. Governments lose debt buyers, central banks intervene, so the system quietly discourages non-participation. Inflation erodes idle savings. Asset ownership is rewarded. Risk-free options disappear. Escape is not illegal. It is simply unaffordable. Modern capitalism also enforces itself psychologically. Risk is framed as responsibility. Debt is framed as opportunity. Participation is framed as adulthood. Non-participation is framed as failure. The most powerful systems do not rely on force, they rely on belief. No committee designed this outcome. It emerged through efficiency incentives, scale requirements, debt mechanics, demographic pressure. Each step seemed rational. Each step solved a problem. Together, they removed alternatives. Capitalism did not become inescapable through malice. It became inescapable because growth demanded universality. Another critical moment in capitalism's transformation came through war. Large-scale war requires mass production, centralized financing, population-wide participation. World War I and World War II fundamentally changed the relationship between citizens, money, and the state. Governments issued massive amounts of debt. Central banks monetized it. Entire populations were mobilized economically. Rationing, wage controls, forced savings programs, and war bonds made participation unavoidable. For the first time, entire societies were financially integrated into a single national balance sheet. After the wars ended, this structure did not disappear. It became permanent. The tools created to mobilize economies for survival were repurposed to manage them in peacetime. This is when capitalism stopped being voluntary at scale. As economies grew more complex, governments increasingly relied on corporations to deliver outcomes. Infrastructure, healthcare, defense, energy, technology. Corporations became extensions of policy. Markets became tools of governance. At the same time, corporations relied on cheap credit, stable demand, regulatory protection. This created mutual dependence. Capitalism stopped being a contest between state and market. It became a hybrid system where failure in one destabilized the other. In such a system, exit is not merely discouraged, it is systemically dangerous. In the late 20th century, capitalism globalized. Supply chains spanned continents. Capital moved freely. Labor did not. This increased efficiency, but it also removed national exit routes. You could no longer escape one system by entering another. Every major economy adopted debt-based money, financialized housing, market-linked retirement, central bank stabilization. Capitalism became global infrastructure. There was nowhere else to go. Technology did not liberate people from capitalism. Automated participation, paychecks became digital, payments became cashless, savings became algorithmic, credit became instant. Every transaction became trackable. Every activity became monetized. Participation no longer required intention. It happened automatically. Opting out required effort. Remaining inside required none. This is how inescapable systems operate. Modern capitalism does not only rely on material dependence, it relies on psychological commitment. The final evolution of capitalism is subtle. It stops being debated. It becomes assumed, like air, like infrastructure, like gravity. You don't opt out of gravity. You adapt to it. Modern capitalism functions the same way. It is no longer an ideology. It is an environment. People feel trapped today because the system has reached maturity. All buffers are financialized. All risks are priced. All alternatives are absorbed. Earlier generations could buy housing cheaply, save without inflation punishment, retire without market exposure. Those exits are gone. What remains is optimization within constraint. The financial system was not designed to trap individuals. It was designed to sustain growth. But once growth required universal participation, escape ceased to exist. Capitalism did not become inescapable overnight. It became inescapable one design choice at a time. If you want to understand how the global financial system actually works, not the simplified version, but the real institutional architecture behind it, this channel breaks it down in a clear and structured way. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of the shifts most people won't recognize until the consequences are already unavoidable.